but deep in my gut, I knew it was exactly where I needed to be. Before making the journey inside, I searched the area for the thickest stick I could find and held it as a makeshift bludgeoning weapon. Coming back to the entrance, I took a moment to steel my nerves, reloaded my gun, put the flashlight in front of me, and walked forward into the tunnel. As I descended deeper, my anxiety grew. Every little sound spiked my heart rate. Every vague shape made me jump back in fear. At one point, I thought I saw a human body face down in the water. When I rushed over to inspect the naked man, I was shocked to see it wasn't a man at all. In my hands was the rotting corpse of the fucking hermit. His head had been partially eaten, and all the flesh inside was rotting away. God, it was a horrible sight. But at the end of the day, I suppose monsters aren't friendly to each other. I dropped the body back in the murky water and spat on it before walking away. Continuing on my journey, I got this sense it would soon be coming to a close. I thought back on the events that had led me to this moment. Everything that had forced me to become the type of person who needed to be out there doing the unthinkable. Officer Ryan's words rang in my head. How far do you want to go with this? Think about what your limits are. As I went forward, I really began to question why my limits had made me suffer. After all this was over, I needed to do some serious thinking. A familiar groan cut my inner dialogue. I froze where I stood and took a deep breath. And slowly, I took short steps forward. Then, the shape of a creature came into view. Walking closer, I saw it resembled the thing I'd seen earlier, albeit slightly taller, with a more masculine chest, thicker frame, noticeable black eyes, and more hair growing out of the sides of its grotesque head. It also clearly had chunks blown out of its leg and what looked to be a golden pocket knife stuck in its side. This was it, the creature responsible for this entire journey. It screamed at me and stomped in the murky water with its hairy feet. But I stood my ground. When it saw I wouldn't budge, it tried intimidating me again, puffing out its chest and making its hair stand on end. But I wouldn't be deterred. No, I was here to finish this, and it caught on quick. In response, it did something odd. It stopped, spat out phlegm, turned around, and started limping in the other direction. There was no chance in hell I was letting it get away. I sprinted towards the thing, jumped forward into the air, and shattered the stick on the back of its head. It didn't do any damage, but the force easily knocked it over. The thing wriggled around on the ground, trying to fight back. Quickly, I pulled out my pistol and shot it into the thing's back. It let out a scream of pain, but I didn't care. Bang! Another into its spine. Bang! One to the injured leg. Bang! Another to its back. Oh, I was seething. Thoughts about what this thing had done to Ernie Garrison and Boris, what it might have done to others, and especially what it had done to an innocent mother and her child. My rage began to take over. I stood over it and unloaded every bullet I had left into its skull, not stopping until I heard the click of an empty gun. But I didn't stop there. I flipped over the body using the butt of my weapon and bashed this thing's face raw, only stopping when I physically couldn't smash it anymore. And then, silence. I was breathing heavily. I looked on at what I'd done, examining the thing for minutes, simply staring. I didn't quite know what to make of how I felt. The rage was gone, but I felt empty. I killed the creature, potentially saved lives, and yet there was nothing. It didn't bring back Ernie Garrison or a young family. Leonard Houston would still be traumatized. Something about it just seemed hollow. Eventually, I stood back up and began to turn back around to leave. But another sound emanated from deeper in the tunnel. Shit, I said to myself. Please don't tell me there's another one. Picked up the remainder of my stick and flashed my light forwards. I took careful steps towards the sound until I reached the source. I almost gagged when I saw 5 greyish-pink miniature versions of the 2 creatures I killed in a nest of rotting flesh. They were fucking breeding. I refused to let the younglings even get the chance to be half as dangerous as their parents. With the remainder of my weapon, I did what I had to do to end the bloodline. It was finally done. I dragged myself back towards my car. I couldn't tell you what was on my mind. I honestly think I just went blank. No feeling of victory, just blank. My only real thought was how to get out of those damn woods. Reaching my car provided the most incredible sense of euphoria I've ever had in my life. I must have sat for half an hour basking in the warmth of the heater and the comfort of my seats. But eventually I managed to call up the chief and tell him everything. I told him where he could find the bodies and that he could do whatever he needed to do, but I wouldn't be there to see it through. I drove straight home and took the most incredible hot shower. 20 minutes later, I changed into some clean clothes and walked to the one place I knew I needed to be, the local bar. The bartender gave me a look of sympathy as I sat down and ordered a shot of whiskey and a cider. I'm sure she'd seen a lot of characters come through in her time and could probably pick out the ones that were hurting from a mile away. When she gave me an extra shot of whiskey on the house, it only reaffirmed that she knew I was going through a rough time. Well, that night I wanted to do my best to forget everything. 2 shots in and I was well on my way. But as I was about to let drunkenness take over, I heard a familiar voice pierce the veil of drifting thought. "Smith, what are you doing here?" I looked over and saw a familiar face staring at me with a wide smile. Detective Joss. Her face was red and I could see she was already a few drinks in. "Detective, Evelyn, fancy meeting you here," I quipped. She laughed and walked over to sit down next to me. "Hope you don't mind me using you to get away from creepy, flirtatious drunk guys," she said with a wink. I laughed. "No problem at all. I never imagined you as a bar type of person. I like to get dressed up and come here sometimes on Fridays, but I've never seen you here before. What gives? And you're a cider guy. That explains a lot." I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, I don't usually go out to drink by myself, but it's been a rough night, I guess you could say. Also, why the hell are you calling me by my last name in a bar? Kinda informal, isn't it?" She shrugged. "Don't know. Honestly, I call you Smith so often I forgot what your first name even is." I chuckled. Dabari, Femi Smith. Yeah, I know it's not a common name, but my mom's Nigerian. My dad's from Birmingham. She wanted to take his last name, but they both wanted to keep in touch with our family's African roots through me. So therefore, the Nigerian first and middle name with an American last name. But growing up, my friends used to just call me Dre." She leaned in closer. I could see the genuine interest in her eyes. "Oh, that's fascinating. There's a real history behind your name." I shrugged. I guess, yeah. I'm sorry. This is, different. I mean, usually we're throwing jabs at each other. Fun jabs, but jabs nonetheless. And now you're here asking about my name. It's just an unexpected change of pace." She pulled back a bit and agreed. "Look, I know it's different, and I know that usually I'm on you in an overbearing way. I swear I'm not always that person. In fact, most of the time, I'm the complete opposite. Some circumstances just make work one of the few places where I can keep my mind off, well, life. Yeah, and I get a little intense." Well, this intrigued me. Taking another sip of my cider, I asked her to tell me about what was going on. At first she was reluctant, but with some prodding I got her to talk, and it was a lot. To summarize, her father was a cop, and not a good one. Not in the sense that he was terrible at his job, but in the sense that he wasn't a good guy on the job. He was corrupt and power-hungry, the type of shitty guy that taints whatever semblance of justice this badge has left. And at home he wasn't much better. Verbal abuse, high expectations, and a cold, distant relationship that she'd never forgive him for. She wanted to do better than him. She wanted to be one of the good ones and, at least in her mind, do something to make up for his mistakes. She threw herself into her work, made sure to be on top of everything that went down to ensure that it was being done the right way. All well and good. Well, she climbed the ranks, being a star cop, and was living out her dreams, until it came to her home life. She was married once, a man she thought was perfect in every way, a man she thought she could trust until she found him in bed with someone else. Blame was thrown around. There were arguments every night. Her fault for being too dedicated to her work, his fault for not wanting a family to give her a reason to slow down. Divorce papers were filed. A deep depression followed. The only thing remaining was the work she now had as her only true outlet to keep her mind busy and away from the thoughts of him. And it was, rough to hear. I tried to offer condolences, but she insisted she didn't need them. Joss was a fighter through and through. From a rough childhood to now, she was determined to figure out a way to make her situation better and live the good life she'd always wanted. What followed, however, was a question that struck me at my core. What about you? I heard you left homicide before I arrived. Now you're back. What happened? I could have given some crappy answer about my mysterious extenuating circumstances, or a simple desire to do something different. But Joss had spent the last who knows how long pouring her life out to me, and at that moment I couldn't help but remember my conversation with Maria Alvarez. Truth is owed truth. And so, I gave it to her. I told her about the night that my wife and young son were murdered in our home while I was away. I was out working a case and came back to find them dead together in the master bedroom. Of course, the police were called. Empty reassurances that we'd find the person who did it were made. I drove around the whole damn county, searching for clues somewhere, anywhere. I followed up on every lead possible. I managed to dig past dead ends. I triple and quadruple checked every piece of information, hoping that I could find the person who killed my beautiful family and put a bullet between their eyes. In the end, I never found them. The case remains cold to this day. All we have to go on is some grainy footage of a man walking away from the scene. He was only on camera for a few seconds, but I must have spent countless hours watching it over and over again, hoping each time that I'd see something new, something relevant, but I never did. And subsequently I left homicide, not being able to deal with seeing the dead bodies and having a breakdown every time I thought of my family. Joss was in shock. I had no idea. I'm so sorry, she said. I told her it was okay. I'd gone through a lot of personal growth to try and move on. It never really leaves you, nor should it. But I was making progress. For the next few hours or so, we bonded over our trauma. Drinking together, we went from talking about our past to our personal interests. Movies, music, politics, and space. Hell, she even told me about a psychedelic trip she had while visiting her family in Sweden. Well, Officer Ryan had mentioned it before, but, well, turns out she really was pretty cool. Eventually, though, as all good things do, our conversation had come to a close. I was exhausted, and the alcohol was telling me I needed to sleep. But before I went, she mentioned that her family owned a cabin a few hours away. She was initially going to go with some friends, but there was a change of plans and then asked if I wanted to go instead. I told her I'd love to. From there, I walked out into the frigid air. On the way home, I had nothing but time to reflect on everything. And with a smile on my face, I finally let my mind wander. As always, stay safe, everyone.
With all the things happening around us, sometimes what we need is a little magic. Magic from captured moments to remind us why we need to keep on going. Let these magical moments fuel your passion. Everything is yours to achieve when you capture your own magic.
Take on every adventure. Conquer tight spaces with Active Park Assist. Enjoy heightened views with the panoramic moonroof. And confidently take on every road with autonomous emergency brakes. Ford Everest.
I investigate disturbing cases. Here are my stories. Episode 5. Voices from Nature. There are few careers with the same considerations as police work. Not only are we in a position to make life-changing choices, but we also have to live with the consequences of those choices forever. It's not something a lot of people can handle. Time and again, we've seen what happens when people who clearly aren't prepared are forced to navigate these intense situations, and it ends in tragedy. You must come to grips with the fact that you'll make decisions that'll stick with you forever, and that those intense decisions add up, sometimes quickly. As the years go on, you have to determine when enough's enough. But it's not just the choices you make for others that matter. The ones you make for yourself can be just as impactful. Detective Joss and I were sitting across from the chief in his office. The two of us being together had become commonplace over the past few months. In retrospect, despite us being his most trusted officers, it was probably still bizarre for him to see us getting along. After the events involving the hammerhead creatures, Joss and I got to know each other on a human level, and from there our connection took off. Looking back, it's interesting how trauma brings people together. "So," the chief began, "you two are going to be gone for the week, yeah?" "Yep," Joss responded. "Up north at the cabin, just like we talked about." He eyed us for a moment, chewing his toothpick. While leaning back in his chair, he turned to me. "Smith, do you know of the family that went missing up in the woods your cabin is located in? A typical nuclear family, taking the grandparents out for a camping weekend." Well, his question caught me off guard. No, I don't believe I've heard of that specifically, but I'm sure a lot of people go missing in the woods every year, don't they?" He nodded. They do. This specific family is intriguing, though. See, they knew the woods. Father's a former ranger. Mother's a wildlife biologist. Grandparents had backgrounds in botany. Hell, even the kids were involved in the scouts. If anyone would have survived a camping trip gone awry, it'd have been them. Well, at any rate, the number of people who've been disappearing up there has been more than alarming. Turning to Joss, he asked, "Joss, you know Sheriff Gadil Cartenia, right?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "One of the best sheriffs I've been around." Indeed he is," the chief said. "As luck would have it, he has jurisdiction over where your cabin's located. I thought it might help him out if you did a little digging while you two were up there. Well, not a full-blown investigation, of course. Maybe ask questions where you can and report back any abnormal findings." Well, I tried my best not to show it, but I was getting incredibly frustrated with the chief. Here we were, about to go on vacation to get away from the insanity of police work and monsters, and yet he wanted us to use our free time for more investigations. "Wait," I interjected. "With all due respect, if it's Sheriff Cartenia's jurisdiction, then it's his business, isn't it? Not only do we have no authority in the area, but it's literally not our job to solve their issues. His own people should be looking into this. If it's a massive concern, why not just shut down the park?" I couldn't tell if the look on the chief's face was one of annoyance or respect regarding my challenge. He took out his toothpick and made a motion as if he was blowing out non-existent smoke. "It's impossible to seal off hundreds of square miles of land. People will find their way into the woods regardless. I understand where you're coming from, though, Smith, but trust me, Sheriff Cartenia has handled the disappearances as best as possible. His people still doing regular patrols and exhausting every lead. I know it's not your job, and you aren't required to do this, but he figured some eyes and ears from outside might help, and I would appreciate the cooperation." I would have told him that we'd rather enjoy the break, but Joss got out in front of me and promised that we'd ask a couple of questions to the locals and keep an eye out. Well, after leaving the office, I informed her that I wasn't too pleased with how that had gone down. Joss apologized and said that we'd keep the police work to a minimum. Well, as much as she wanted to please the chief, she also wanted to enjoy the time we had. She made the promise that this minor inconvenience wouldn't get in the way of that. Reluctantly, I decided to go along with it. Well, a week passed and we were finally on our way. The car ride up north might have been one of the best parts of the trip. My worries about how our vacation would turn into work melted away when we were deep in conversation, laughter, and rapping along to Odyssey and Tupac. After about 4 or 5 hours of driving, she pulled into a diner in some small town. As soon as we walked in, it was evident that we stuck out. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant turned to us. I tried to give a friendly wave to a family sitting across from us, but they simply gave me a nasty look and turned back to their food. Slightly offended, I figured it was best to ultimately try and ignore it. Luckily, we didn't get hassled much as we ate, paid, and then walked out. Well, that is until we caught a man in an apron admiring our car. "Hey," I yelled from across the parking lot. "Something interesting about that to you?" The man turned around and gave a warm smile. On his apron had the name of the diner on the front, and his name tag read, Ariel Attias, head chef. "Oh, hey guys," he said kindly while walking over to us. He extended his hand and I cautiously shook it. "A little casual for someone casing our car," Joss said, crossing her arms. He looked at the car momentarily before looking back at us and waving it off. "I swear, it's nothing. It's just a really nice ride. We don't see too many cars that look like that out here, so while on a break, I just wanted to take a closer look. In fact, neither of you really look like you're from around here. Take it you're visiting?" "Uh-huh," I replied. "Look, if this is some ploy to slash our tires and take us off to some burrasca in the middle of the mountains where you have a bunch of other people tied up, I just want to let you know we carry guns." He laughed at my scenario. "I'm not quite sure what a burrasca is, but you have quite the imagination. Honestly, being from up north, I'm not really for violence. I try and bring that Canadian friendliness to my restaurant here." "And your patrons?" Joss asked. "They don't seem too friendly." Well, Ariel shrugged. "Yeah, it's not that they're not friendly. Well, we've been having a lot of issues as of late. People used to say how much they loved our food and talking to the townspeople. They'd always come back on their way out of town. Hasn't happened a single time this year. I think now when new people come in, there's just a bit of morbid curiosity, I guess you could say." "I've heard about those disappearances," I replied. "You know anything about them?" He shook his head. "Sorry, honestly, I wish I did. Everyone in town is genuinely afraid to even step foot in the woods. Oh, we've come up with this saying, the trees watch you, so take that as you will." He laughed nervously. "Anyway, I'm just rambling. Just hoping you guys stay safe out there." And with that, he walked back inside the diner. Well, as ominous as the parting message was, it provided little insight. Still, when I looked over at Joss, I could see she was lost in thought, much in the same way I was whenever I got a new case. I asked if she was okay, and she insisted she was fine. Not wanting to dwell too much on the encounter, we made our move to leave. As soon as we got in the car, a text message popped onto my phone, one from the chief, and it read, "Talked to Sheriff Cartenia today. The family of a backpacker reported she never returned home. The kid was only 18. We need to figure this out." Well, my loud groan made my feelings apparent. Well, of course I wanted to help, but it felt as though the very atmosphere was shifting with every mile we drove, placing us deeper and deeper into a situation we didn't go there to deal with. What was supposed to be a fun getaway was quickly becoming something much more sinister. Picking up on the changing mood, Joss made a hard right at the next intersection out of nowhere. According to my directions, we weren't heading the right way now. When I tried to bring this up, Joss shushed me and commented that she didn't want to ruin the surprise. 30 minutes later, we pulled up to a medium-sized house at the edge of the woods, and Joss was telling me to get out. The unkempt plants growing in and around the structure exacerbated an already rustic look. Confused, I asked what exactly we were doing there as I stepped outside. She met me on my side of the car, and with a giant smile on her face said, "We're going to get drunk and hear some fun stories." Here? I asked. Am I, missing something? Are we supposed to go to the cabin? Joss laughed as she walked up to the door and knocked. Trust me, this guy is a close family friend. I've visited him every time I came up here since I was a kid. Still puzzled, I looked at her with a raised eyebrow and crossed arms. Well, I mean, I'm up for it, but it seems a little out of the blue, doesn't it? Before answering my question, she knocked again at the door. Sure, but Mr. Oak is a really fun guy. He tells fantastic stories. And since he's a former bartender, he makes the best drinks. Well, I thought we could stay here, make a few drinks, and have some fun. Maybe get back on the road tomorrow since we've been driving all day. Well, that's if he opens up this century, I quipped. A brief look of concern was her response to my statement. When she went to knock again, the door creaked open before her knuckles could even touch the wood. Well, the person on the other side certainly wasn't the older man Joss had described. The woman looking back at us seemed to be in her mid-20s. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and she had the eyes of someone that hadn't slept in a meaningful amount of time. Immediately, Joss went into cop mode and reached for a gun that wasn't there before hitting the woman with a barrage of questions. Most notably, who are you and why are you in Mr. Oak's home? Completely unfazed by the confrontation, the young woman yawned and nonchalantly replied, I'm Amelia. Granddad hasn't been here since the beginning of the year. I'm just keeping an eye on the place. Realizing she was merely a relative, Joss allowed her body to relax. But something in her tone insinuated that she still didn't trust this supposed granddaughter. Oh, she said, bringing her hands to her hips. Sorry to scare you. I'm a family friend. I wasn't aware Mr. Oak had gone. Well, you said, what, since the beginning of the year? Do you know when exactly he left? Amelia thought for a moment and gave a half-hearted, February. Couldn't be much later than that. He left a note saying he was going to do a lot of traveling. Joss considered this for a moment and motioned for me to come towards them. Interesting. Do you know where your grandfather is now? She shook her head. No, he hasn't returned since he left, but I'm sure he's fine just like everyone else. Well, that statement caught my attention. Wait, just like everyone else? Who exactly is everyone else? Well, her entire demeanor shifted after my question. Her eyes immediately darted to the woods behind us. A nervous smile grew on her face, and the inflection of her voice signified mild discomfort. Oh, I just meant like in general. Granddad's a tough guy. He told me he was doing well a couple of days ago. I wanted to press further, but Joss stopped me before I could ask any more questions and interjected with, Oh, my mistake then. Sorry to bother you. We'll be on our way. Without another word, we left. The hastiness of the exit had me in shock. Here we had a direct connection to the disappearances, one that maybe could have led us to some exciting information, and yet the hard-ass of all hard-asses wanted to just drop it. The ride from the Oak home to the cabin was roughly another couple of hours, and half the time I tried to get a reason as to why she didn't press it, but she wouldn't budge. When we arrived, I meant to push the point more, but my immediate attention was stolen by the beauty of the nature surrounding us. The lush green forests, rolling hills, and endless wilderness were breathtaking. The cabin itself had a very modern look to it. It was large enough to house a family, but cozy enough to not be overwhelmed by the space. A small lake sat next to it, and a fire pit was a brief walk away. This is beautiful, I stated. All this to ourselves? Joss nodded. Yep, just us, nature, and whatever horrible monstrosities have taken visitors. Well, we don't know there are monstrosities. The fact is that this forest is enormous. Pretty easy for people to get lost. I also wouldn't rule out the possibility of some rogue predator that realized it's easier to hunt people than deer. She shrugged and went to sit on the bed. Well, I hope you're right. Just seems like a lot of strange occurrences have happened since we got here. In the years I've been doing this, that usually means something. Well, isn't that why you told the chief you'd look into it? The way her demeanor shifted indicated that my question was taken in a way that I didn't intend. "Don't do that," she snapped. "All I wanted was for us to be out here together. Appeasing the chief just seemed like the quickest way for that to happen. Plus, at the end of the day, I still feel at least a slight obligation to do my job." Well, I threw my hands up and explained that I in no way meant to offend. It just seemed as though she really wanted to take on the challenge of figuring things out. And that was a trait that I admired. A loud exhale escaped her. Just apologized for being so quick to anger. She explained how stressful it was to balance her allegiance to her work and her genuine desire to make progress with me in her personal life. Well, it's a feeling I could relate to. I assured her that how she was going about it was fine. I wanted to spend time with her too, and we agreed to handle things as they come. Of course, we'd do our best to enjoy the beautiful environment, but if something strange came our way, then we'd be ready for that too. We spent the rest of the day exploring the woods around us, telling stories over a campfire, and then retiring for the night. Laying together in bed, we made plans to explore and hike up to a spot that overlooks miles of forest. Well, ideally, we'd stay up there, come back, make some food, do some target practice with the gun she had there, and then wind down by the lake. Everything seemed set up for a fantastic day, and the following morning at first, it was all trending in that direction. We made breakfast, packed our supplies, and headed out. The trail was, admittedly, a little rougher than I'd anticipated. Still, Joss, who's an avid runner and general health nut, was kind enough to go closer to half speed to let me catch up. Once we'd made it to the top, I couldn't believe my eyes. The view was unlike anything I was used to seeing. The mighty army of vibrant green trees extended infinitely into the horizon. The massive hills staring back at us held the promise of undiscovered ecosystems waiting to be explored. The nearby lake gleamed as the rays from the sun made the surface appear as though thousands of crystals were occupying it. It was absolute paradise. And to top it all off was being there with Joss. The look in her eyes showed a deep appreciation for what we had the privilege to observe. For so long it felt like much of my time was dedicated to seeing either the worst of humanity or the worst of the paranormal. With each passing case, I could feel my stress heightening and my sanity slipping. But for the first time in a long time, the world felt right. It felt peaceful. After an hour or so, hunger eventually pushed us to make our way back to the cabin. I couldn't pinpoint what or why, but something told me that that peaceful moment would be our last on this trip. I didn't want to freak out Joss, so I kept quiet out of hope that I was simply being paranoid. But as we rounded the final turn off the trail that put the cabin in view, my fears were confirmed. A woman was on the porch, in the fetal position. Instinctively, I pulled my pocket knife, and Joss mirrored the action. Creeping out slowly towards the person, I shouted, "Hey, this is private property. You need to identify yourself." The woman on the porch looked up at us, and I immediately recognized her. "Amelia," Joss shouted in disbelief. "Oh my God, what on earth are you doing here? How are you here?" Before I could stop her, she'd already rushed over to the young girl and began helping her inside. Now, don't get me wrong, I understood why Josh was so gung-ho to help the granddaughter of a childhood friend, but this was clearly very off. By the time I caught up, Amelia was wrapped up in a blanket on the couch and crying her eyes out. I tried to get Amelia to explain what had happened and how she'd ended up at the cabin, but she wasn't making any sense. She went on some tangent about being led there, before having a full-blown panic attack. She needed time to calm down, so Joss and I decided that it'd be best for us to walk down by the lake to give her some space. Once we were out of earshot, I looked Joss dead in the eye and said, "Tell me you don't think this is odd." Well, she took offense to my statement. "Of course I think this is odd. You think I think this is normal?" "No, it's just, I don't know that we should have been so quick to take her in. You and I have seen enough to understand that this is right on the edge of no plan." "Dre, I get it. I don't even understand how she could have possibly made it out here. Forget not knowing how to get here. I didn't see another car. Walking the road to get here is a rough day for anybody. But, well, Mr. Oak is like family to me. If there's a chance his daughter's in trouble, I need to be there for her. even if it's under weird circumstances. Well, no part of me liked the answer, and frankly, if it were up to me, I don't know that I would have let her stay around. But at the end of the day, it wasn't my call to make. This was her cabin, and I needed to respect and trust Joss. Without any argument, I simply replied, "Okay." Soon after, we made our way back inside and found Amelia had calmed down a bit. I made us all some coffee and asked her if she'd be comfortable speaking about what had happened. She gave a reluctant nod and wiped away the remaining tears. She attempted to look Joss in the eyes before speaking, but ultimately turned her gaze downward and began crying again and shouted, "I'm so sorry. I lied. Oh my God, I lied." Confused, Joss bent down and put a hand on the young girl. "You lied? About what? What do you mean?" "Granddaddy, he never went on a trip. He's gone." "What?" Joss half shouted while popping up. "Where and when did he go missing?" "Earlier in the year, he went into the woods and he never came back." "Did you report this to the police?" I interjected. "Of course we did," Amelia shot back. "But they'll never find him. They could search every inch of that forest and it won't matter." My brain immediately flipped back to being a detective, and my questioning became a little more intense. "How could you know for a fact that they'll never find him?" For the slightest moment, she gave me an odd look. The contortion of her brows seemed to signal disbelief, as if she expected me to know the answer to her question. "Because they don't know what to look for. It's not—" She sighed. "He's different now." "Amelia," Joss began, "what do you mean by different? And do you know if your grandfather's okay?" Tears began to well up in her eyes again, but oddly enough, there was a smile, too. "I know for a fact that Granddad is fantastic. He's living well and better than ever." Joss and I shared a look of confusion at this statement. Literally none of this fit. In our brief moment of interaction, Joss must have been able to read my mind because she asked a question that was also at the forefront of my brain. "Amelia, how did you know how to find us here?" A moment of silence followed. Amelia seemed to be contemplating how to tell us. Still, without her saying a word, I knew the answer would be an incredibly uncomfortable one. When she finally found the word, she simply turned to look out a window and stated, "Granddad told me." She gave us a quick glance before looking back out the window and continuing, "I can hear his voice from all around. He said a lot of things, and they scare me. You both needed to know." I didn't know what to make of what she was saying, as much as I wanted to dismiss that she was just getting mental messages from her potentially dead grandfather. I'd seen too much to rule anything out. On the flip side, it also wouldn't be the first time someone had, in reality, done something awful and then played it off with talks of voices in their head. But at the end of the day, I needed to approach the situation rationally. I couldn't believe it was supernatural until I saw the supernatural. I suggested that she let us drive her into town. Ideally, we'd get her checked into a hospital, and maybe she could give the local police any information garnered from the voice of her grandfather. Joss shut down the idea and instead insisted that Amelia stay. She was adamant about monitoring her, at least for the night. Joss later confessed that getting rid of Amelia without calming her down under supervision would be like abandoning her. She wouldn't do that to the family of a close friend. It was a rationale I didn't necessarily agree with, but one that I respected. We went about setting up the guest room for Amelia and spent the rest of the day fishing and taking shifts watching over her. For most of the day, Amelia sat silently in her room. She'd be on her bed and stare out of the window, seemingly in deep thought. I'd try and talk with her, but the most I could ever get out was a brief glance in my direction. Eventually, the time came for me to go to bed. I walked to the kitchen to brush my teeth and caught Amelia sitting at the table drinking some tea. By this point, I didn't expect any sort of acknowledgement of my presence, but to my surprise, she gave me a very warm, "Hey, Dre." Well, a little caught off guard, I greeted her back, but ultimately thought nothing of it. That is, until she got up and started to walk out. Just before reaching her room, she stopped, turned around, and stared at me. an unnervingly wide smile plastered on her face. "You've seen terrible things, haven't you? Tragic." And with that, she simply went into her room. I sat in silence for some time, just thinking. Was Amelia referring to the paranormal? The murders I've investigated in my career? Or was it something more personal? I hadn't known this girl for more than 48 hours. How could she be aware of anything? Either way, her statement rattled me. Joss asked what had taken me so long. I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Maybe that was a poor choice, I don't know. Well, at a certain point, you just want to be done with the weirdness and move on. I told Joss that I'd been thinking, and when she pressed me for details, I promised I'd tell her in the morning. And luckily, she accepted that answer. Joss drifted off fast in my arms. But despite her being right there with me, I felt alone. Amelia's words unearthing a river of memories that I'd floated down. Reflections on my life, my mistakes, and the choices I've yet to make lulled me into a largely dreamless sleep. A ritual that I'd grown accustomed to. Oddly enough, the only mental image I can recall was that of the Watcher saying we'd all be safer with them. Well, I don't know how much I slept, but it was clearly very early in the morning when I woke up. The sun had just begun to rise, and Joss had the blanket pulled over her face on the other side of the bed. I sat with my eyes open for a moment, when the realization hit me that I wasn't going to be able to fall back asleep. So with a quiet groan, I pulled myself out of bed, put on some clothes, and walked over to the kitchen to grab some water and brush my teeth. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was that 9mm ammo had been left on the table. Confused, I walked over to Amelia's room and found that she'd left. Her space was clean, and nothing indicated that she'd left in a hurry. At first, I figured that she'd likely gone into the woods to shoot. Perhaps Joss told her where to find the gun while watching over. When I went outside to try and find Amelia, I immediately noticed more bullets had been dropped, and they led to a nearby trail. As I walked to the trailhead, I heard a gunshot coming from that same direction. Well, I figured I'd follow the trail and hopefully meet up with her at some point. But not too long after I'd started walking, I heard an eerily familiar voice call out to me from deep in the forest. A voice so familiar, in fact, that it froze me in place. I dared not move from my spot in hopes it would call out again. Tears began to make their way down my face. I knew that it was probably some fucked up trick being played on me, but I didn't care. The moment I recognized that it was my son's voice calling out to me, my baby boy calling for his father, I sprinted off towards it. I'd seen so much in my time investigating the paranormal that I suppose a small piece of me hoped that somehow, some way, something had brought him back. Even if there was a 1% chance, I had to take it. So I ran and ran, my boy guiding me towards his location. I called out to him. He needed to know that his father was finally going to be there for him. I had no idea where I was headed, and I didn't care. I just kept going until I physically couldn't do so any longer. But ultimately my efforts had brought me no closer to him. Instead, I found myself in a grave situation. I'd blindly run off trail into the woods, and now I was surrounded by nothing but trees. Oh, how could I be so stupid? I thought to myself. The voice had seemed so real. The only thing it had led me to was getting lost. It was the first time I had to consider whether or not I was indeed going mad. That consideration grew stronger when I saw what appeared to be a face embedded into the wood of a tree just to my right. Whoever it was seemed to be in anguish, their face seemingly twisted by unbearable pain. Now, one would assume this was a case of face pareidolia, the phenomenon where humans interpret random patterns as faces. But if it was just a random pattern, it was a convincing one. It was as if the bark itself had instantly grown around this person, capturing a snapshot of their suffering. When I walked over to inspect the tree behind it, it was the same scene. Another person experiencing great pain frozen into the wood. The third tree mirrored that, then a fourth. Soon I realized that I was surrounded by an army of petrified faces. Before I could even process what could have possibly caused this messed up exhibition, My son's voice broke through the confusion. It didn't take long to find the source. A tree that appeared younger and thinner than the rest, slightly further out from the others. At its base was the face of a young boy. It looked like he'd been crying. I went to wipe the frozen tears from his face and kiss his forehead. A small smile crept across my face, and I hugged the tree. It had been far, far too long since I'd seen my son's face. "Don't cry, Dad. You're finally here," he said to me. I suppose I didn't notice my tears and quickly wiped them away as I tried to ask how he'd ended up there. "It was dark," he explained. "After that day, it was really dark, but one day I felt light, growth, and pain, and then just light again." I wanted to talk more, ask how I could help, what I could do. But before I got the chance, something else came through. "My love, it's been so long," she said in her beautifully sweet voice. "Olia," I shouted back. How are you both?" "Alive," she said softly with a laugh. "It wasn't thanks to you, you cowardly bastard." "What?" I asked in disbelief. "No, this isn't. This can't be." "Oh, but it is." Her tone became much darker. "You left your wife and son to die, my love. I told you I wanted you to find new work. I told you putting people in prison would make enemies. I told you, and now..." She was leading me to finish her sentence, but I couldn't. No, I mumbled under my breath. "There's no way." I stood up, shouting, "You're not them. You're some kind of apparition, a fucking lie." A new voice emerged from the tree, one I didn't recognize. The voice was deep and monotone. "A lie? No, Smith. We are truth. We are life." The curtain had finally dropped. Something sinister had been imitating my family, and I was furious. "What kind of life could you possibly be? Look around. All I see is a sick imitation of death." It laughed an unimpressed laugh. "We grow. Our cells divide. We turn sunlight into energy. You call that death? We've brought life back from the husks of the dead. Our roots and mycelial networks are far-reaching from here to your home and far beyond. We connect everything. We absorb everything, and we see everything." His voice quickly shifted to that of a young girl. "Remember me, Detective Smith?" Who are you?" Figures. I'm the little girl you let die because you were too overconfident to call backup, or stay to fight even if it cost you your life. You wanted all the glory for yourself, but you couldn't handle the fire when it got too hot, huh? Coward. Faye, Mizuki had come back from the grave. The greatest failure of my career was literally staring back at me, and I was speechless. Well, the voice switched up again, and this time the entity's choice shocked me, and I blurted out her name as soon as it introduced itself. "Amelia." "That's right. You know there's a better path, Smith. One where you can make up for all the terrible things you've seen and done. Grandad had been speaking to me about joining this and becoming something more extraordinary. I was scary at first, thinking about leaving behind my old life. But we're so much happier now. That's how we found you, you know. He was here the whole time, all around." I staggered back from this horrible scene. "Amelia, oh my God, I'm so sorry." "Why be sorry? This is life. We'll outlast everyone else for centuries and then grow anew. I can tell you're scared, though. Well, don't worry. The others that came through were scared too. But I can promise you they're so much happier now." "Wait, others that came through? Here?" I asked. "You don't mean the missing people, do you? Jeez, that's where they've gone. You lured them in and then..." "And then showed them happiness," the monotone voice finished. "No one could possibly know a better paradise." That's why they're all suffering like hell, huh? I spat back. My God, look at the faces. There was no waver in its voice. Growth is pain. As it said this, I felt something slice at my leg. Happiness requires growth. Therefore, you must experience pain to be happy. As much as I wanted to trade jabs with this thing, I could feel my legs starting to go numb and my eyes growing heavy. My following few words were a jumbled mess, but I was conscious enough to understand my danger level. I attempted to turn in the other direction, but my foot caught a stray root, and I crashed onto the forest floor. The trees seemed more extensive now. Their roots moved quickly towards me, and wooden tentacles wrapped around my leg. I shouted for them to get away, but to no avail. Multiple voices from all directions surrounded me, many I didn't recognize. "You'll be happy here. We survive better together," said one. "Why fight to be apart? This is your fate anyway," another chimed in. The pressure building around my leg was growing, and with all my might, I couldn't detach from the organism. The last things I saw before my vision went dark were more mycelial tendrils and roots that had sprung up around me. Well, my final thought was the slight comfort in knowing that, at the very least, I'd be with my family again. Silence followed. No thoughts, no feeling. It was as if I was disconnected from the world. And in that moment of nothing, I felt as though I could finally let go. Suddenly, light flooded back into my world. A dry heave followed, and so did waves of pain. Joss was looking down at me. We were still outside, but in a different spot than we'd been in before. Before I could say anything, she pulled me into a tight hug. Beside her laid an axe covered in plant matter. I could only manage to eke out a weak, "What happened?" Well, supposedly Joss noticed Amelia and me missing after she woke up. The ammo left on the table gave her reason for concern, especially given previous reports of missing people, so she grabbed an axe and set out to find us. The extra bullets left at the head of the northern trail tipped her off as to our direction. As she searched, she also heard a voice that guided her to where she needed to be, that of her father. The difference between us being that Joss wasn't as entranced by the call. When she finally found me, nearly my entire body was wrapped in the green and white tendrils. They squirmed and grew as they entered my body through various cuts. Apparently it took her at least half an hour to completely cut me out. The thing I couldn't understand is how she was able to ignore the entity. Surely it wouldn't just let her take me. And, as expected, it didn't. The dead voices of her past whispered sweet nothings of eternal life, happiness, and infinite growth. Even Amelia had taken a shot at convincing Joss to move on to the next life, as she'd done at the end of a bullet. For every mycelia and root she cut, it tried reconnecting with her, so she had to keep a constant offense to keep from joining the literal legion of the dead. When I was finally free enough, she dragged me just far enough to get away from whatever the hell that entity was. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? After hearing her story, I just sat contemplating what had taken place. For all the things I've seen and fought against, I've been bruised, scared, slammed, but never once had anything gotten into my head like that. Never once had something made me break down mentally. Joss stayed with me the whole time as I gathered my thoughts until finally I said the magic words, "Let's go home." Packing up was quick, and we rode silently back. When we finally arrived at my place, I didn't say anything as I got out of the car. A simple kiss on the forehead was our only means of communication. And it stayed that way for the rest of the week. I spent all my time at home, just thinking. When I was finally due back at work, I wore my best suit, showed up exactly on time, and went straight to the chief's office to place my badge and gun on his desk with my official resignation letter. "I'm done," I said to him. He eyeballed the items for a moment. Then he looked up at me, leaned back in his chair, and gave a very matter-of-fact, "About time." Well, his blasé attitude infuriated me. I'd been to hell and back for him many times over. And when it was over, that's all I got. It was goddamn insulting. What the hell does that mean? I half shouted. No thanks. No trying to convince me to stay. Just an apathetic comment. He leaned forward, calmly picked up my resignation letter, and neatly placed it in his inbox sitting on his desk. Smith, do you remember how many days off of work you took after your family's passing? No, I don't remember. But what does that have to do with... None, he interjected. Not a single day off. Sure, homicide was challenging, but damn it if you didn't try. Your work never suffered. You never complained. Smith, your ability to deal with adversity is far beyond what most people are capable of. And I needed that. I needed you. To go through what you've gone through and still see things through to the end is remarkable. Hell, if 99% of people knew this was part of the job, they'd never join the force in the first place. His speech wasn't making me any happier. So you use my trauma to your advantage, and that's good? Not at all. He took a moment to open his drawer and pull out a cigar, place it in his mouth, and light it in one smooth movement. I know I'm not supposed to be smoking in here, but what the hell? I'm not a heartless bastard. The human side of me doesn't want anybody to deal with this shit, especially not someone that's seen so much. Part of me wished that you quit, but... He stopped to exhale and take another puff. At the same time, some things are necessary. Someone had to deal with this stuff. I want you to do the right thing, Smith. Well, I want to do the right thing, Smith, and you were the perfect guy to help me with that. It's so much bigger than my feelings or yours. Judge me however you want for that. It's going to be tough to replace you, but that part of me, the human element of me, is so happy to see you go. So yes, it is about damn time. His words impacted me more than I thought they would. I stood there, not knowing what to say. Ultimately, I opted for silence. I needed time to process this, all of this. I gave him a simple nod of understanding, and from there, I walked out and never returned. In the following months and years, I did my best to return to a normal life. Well, as I'm sitting here writing this, Joss, or Evelyn, I should say, is talking to a few of our friends about our upcoming baby shower. Officer Ryan is most excited about it. He's insistent that our kids will be best friends. Writing these stories has given me so much perspective on these events. Retelling them and reading the feedback has meant so much, and I thank you all for that. Well, I'm at a place where I've realized the truth is the most significant contribution I can give to people. It feels so good to be able to share that. As for the monsters, none have made any surprise appearances. Well, unsurprisingly, life has been much better without them. Granted, Evelyn came home from work the other day talking about how some birthday party ended up with multiple people dead. Supposedly a neighbor mentioned something about a clown, but didn't want to speak further on it. When she told me, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and that old urge began to come back. Part of me feels it couldn't hurt to do some research, talk to some people, just to make sure everyone's doing okay. But another part of me says to enjoy the quiet life. It's an internal debate I've had many times. Office work doesn't quite satisfy that itch. Maybe it doesn't need to. Perhaps I can finally be satisfied with just being happy. I guess I'll have to see what the future holds. I'm really excited about it. And as always, stay safe, everyone. So a really enjoyable series there. Took a bit of time for the final episode to come out, my apologies for that, but well worth it. And as ever, I decided to stick them all together in one long video because, well, whenever I ask the question, do you want me to do it, the answer is invariably yes. So I hope the timestamps in the video description helps you find the right spot for those of you who'd already listened to the other stories. And I guess, well, a lot of you tend to listen to the whole thing again, which I hope is equally enjoyable. Well, that's enough for me for this Sunday, but back again tomorrow night with something else very special. Till then, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.